Hello everyone, this is Not Too Interesting with another video. Now I'm interviewing, you could say your name,
You can call me Brady.
Brady.
Yep.
Alright, interviewing Brady from the subreddit r slash monarchism. He's a progressive monarchist. Could you just say what does that mean?
So, a progressive monarchist is um, someone who is considers themselves a monarchist, believes in the government system of monarchy, but considers themselves um, on the left side of the spectrum. So, usually someone who would identify as a liberal, probably.
Alright. Okay, I have to admit I'm pretty new to this whole political theory, but just tell me what is monarchism in general?
Yeah, so monarchism is not necessarily an ideology because it can extend across the political spectrum. So you have monarchists who are on the very far left, who I believe there's such thing as anarcho monarchism, which I don't know much about, but I've heard the phrase. And then you go all the way to the right, where you have very, very conservative monarchists. So it's not necessarily a political ideology, but rather a system of government that revolves around the hereditary succession of power, um, usually to the head of state and head of government, um, usually deeply rooted in current historical monarchies. The difference between a monarchist and a royalist is that a monarchist believes in the system and the idea of monarchy, where a royalist is someone who supports a specific royal family. So you can have a British royalist, but you could also have a Thai royalist.
Alright. But tell me, what were the merits of it? Because as you said, it's the hereditary passing down of power. Why is that system of passing down power, say, beneficial, or what's the merit of monarchy in your own eyes?
In my eyes, as a progressive monarchist, we would say that that creates an apolitical head of state where someone is guaranteed power, and so that they don't have to perform for it. They don't have to adopt certain positions, they don't have to appease people, they don't have to, put up with lobbyists and the such. So having that apolitical head of state is critical um, for a progressive monarchist, whereas for someone who might be more in the center or more on the right, they would say that there are other reasons for having a hereditary monarch, either by tradition or other belief systems. But primarily, for us at least, it would be to have an apolitical head of state that doesn't have to sort of bow down to the political theater.
All right. But what I will say as a bit of a counter argument to that, every king, in my opinion, had to have a court. It isn't just the king rules of everything, it's the lords of, say, this province, the lord of this city. If you're going to have a monarch, there's going to be other lords and other sort of, say, sub kingdoms under him that pay tribute to him. Wouldn't he have to?
Yes.
Wouldn't he have to court their favor as well?
Yeah, so the nobility played a role in a lot of medieval monarchies because a lot of medieval monarchies were not very powerful. You think of like the king being this, obviously the head of state, but as you're completely right that the king was often subject to the whim of the lords. That's why you saw a figure like uh, King Louis XVI of France, who was their last king, and he we can talk about him if you want in depth, but he was seriously held back by the lords because anything that he did to appease the estates general would have massively decreased the power of the lords. So you're right that you can definitely get bogged down in politics if you have to appease the nobility, but in most modern Western constitutional monarchies, that's not a problem. You don't have powerful nobility, only the monarch holds political power.
All right, all right. But even now, wouldn't he still today have to bow down or kowtow to some people because one man can't rule everything? One man isn't smart enough, isn't attentive enough, and doesn't have enough time. or ability to rule everything. In a
That's
modern
that's
system.
true. Um, Much like the president would have their cabinet and that they would have a slew of advisors, the monarch. Well, let's step back for a second. You say that in a very talking about like the everyday governing, and in a lot of constitutional monarchies, the monarch is not going to be involved in everyday governing. That's not primarily the role of this sort of apolitical head of state that we talk about.
Hmm.
That would be the role of an absolute monarch. And there are absolute monarchies today. If you look at the Gulf states like the United Arab Emirates or Qatar or I believe Bahrain, like those are absolute monarchies. But as you say, they have people around them that run the government, and so that does create politics. And the whole point of having an apolitical head of state is to avoid that. So progressive monarchists do not believe in the absolute monarchy. They don't see it as sort of the perfect solution. I personally do not agree with absolute monarchism. I don't think it particularly works. And so, on the progressive side, we advocate for a constitutional monarchy where you have an apolitical head of state acting in a guidance role or a supervisory role above an elected government. And so, you don't see a modern Western monarch taking part in the day to day activities of the government. That would be uh, an infringement on the people's right to elect, their leaders who run their lives. But in the end, you have an apolitical ceiling above them. Yeah, I think you get what I meant there.
All right, all right. So I'm gonna say what you just said, but tell me if I got everything correct.
Yeah,
So in this system, you suppose the everyday ruling is going to be done by this council, this cabinet, this elected officials, and then above them, superseding them, is the monarch who has the final say. Is that about it?
yeah, and that is how constitutional monarchies function. So countries like the United Kingdom, countries like Norway, countries like the Netherlands, that is how they work. And so some people in the monarchist community might refer to them as ceremonial monarchies because they believe that those monarchs do not actually have political power. But I would fight back against that because constitutionally, the King of the United Kingdom, King Charles III, he has significant political power, and his mother yielded that power, wielded, not yielded, quite quite well and quite often, if not behind closed doors. Excuse me. So,
Mhm.
um, yeah, I mean that is a reality in a lot of countries where you have an elected government, you have the prime minister and their cabinet running the country under hopefully the watchful eye of an apolitical person.
Okay, okay. But why would the monarch be apolitical?
Because the monarch only has the country's best interests at heart. The monarch is of the people. They not of the people as in they've come from the people, but of the people in that they are the nation. They are the flesh and blood representation of the country. And so it is in their best interest to maintain the country, to maintain the people, and to advocate for the best possible outcome for their people. They have no, they should, excuse me, they should have no financial gains to have through politics. They should have no reason to betray the people if the system works correctly.
That is curious to me. Not to sound like I'm coming at this at a combative way, but the monarch is still a man. He's still a man.
Yes,
He's not a part. He's not directly a part of the kingdom. Like King Charles is not England.
not physically, no, but spiritually, that is how many monarchists would think of the monarch. That is why it was radical and kind of insane to many monarchists that King Charles would publicly announce his cancer diagnosis because many people see the monarch as not a mortal human, but rather the personal embodiment of the nation. And so when the monarch is sick, the country is sick, and that's not a good look.
Hmm. Hmm. You speak a lot about this spiritual, how should I say, this spiritual point of view where the monarch and the nation is one and the same. Could you go deeper into that?
Yeah, I mean that this is my personal beliefs that I believe are shared by other monarchists to different degrees and different levels, and it's been seen throughout history that that is how many countries perceive themselves. But yeah, so it's a connection between the monarch and the people. We know that monarchs were the earliest monarchs were usually the strongest warriors, those who were able to amass the largest armies either through pure power or by charisma. But those leaders have passed down through generations and become the hereditary monarchies that we know today. So we know they are not physically created from the soil and from the trees and the mountains, but in a spiritual sense, that is what they represent. They represent the people, they represent the nation, and they have no other priority. There is no, they're not in sort of the rat race, as many people say. You know, their job is to be for the people. They don't. There's no incentive for them to make money. There's no incentive for them to get ahead. They're as high as you can get. You know, there's nothing else for them to do, and so you create you when you have a person grow up like that, and if they are taught correctly, if they are able to have a good apprenticeship under a parent, hopefully a successful monarch, they're able to learn that. And that's why people often say, well, what if, you know, down the line you get a king that's crazy? Usually, a lot of these horrific monarchs that we've seen throughout history came to the throne quite young or came to the throne very inexperienced. And so you see someone like King Charles III, whose apprenticeship was 70 years. And he is sort of the textbook monarch of being able to be comforter in chief while also wielding political power behind closed doors and being able to represent the nation on the international stage and at home. So, no, he is not made out of the country, but in the spiritual sense, he is the nation. He is the living embodiment of the United Kingdom.
Okay, okay. So I suppose this leader, the one of the key intents and key purposes of having a monarchy is to have essentially a line of people whose sole concern is the nation, where they in their personhood, as far as they are concerned, and the nation is concerned, they're one and the same. So you essentially have a line of people whose sole duty is most importantly in their eyes to the nation. Is that a key point of monarchy?
I believe so, yes. And I think that other monarchists, even further to the right of the political sphere, would agree that that is sort of the ideal of monarchism. It's rare to see it, and I think that we all were privileged with growing up in the era of looking up to an incredible monarch like Elizabeth II. And obviously, this ideal has not always become the reality, but yes, that is the hope and the goal of monarchy is to have someone like that, to have a successful line of people that are able to grow up with that being the goal in mind and carry out that duty until they no longer can, and then it goes on again, just in the same way that you have people that own restaurants for generations or they build houses for generations. You know, these these families that have specific goals or specific roles in society, in our belief system, there should be a family that their sole purpose is to be the ruler.
All right, all right. It's kind of beautiful when you put it that way.
Isn't it? I mean, it's definitely an
It is.
idealistic and sort of optimistic view of humanity, but
Mhm.
it's something that we can strive for, and it's something that is possible that we have seen. I mean, King Charles III, for all his scandals and things that have happened, you know, he grew up learning from what I would consider one of the best monarchs in the last 1,000 years. and he will continue on. His son is an incredible man, incredible husband, and his grandchildren appear to be growing up in the same sense. So it is something that we can see. It's not make believe. It's not invisible. It's something that is possible to achieve.
All right, all right. I do believe. I just thought just came to me. Every man seeks to take the best care of himself. Every man cares deeply about himself and will often and will always, in most cases, do what's best for him. Sort of a person who is both capable, able, and is competent enough to see himself and the nation as the same and to do what is best for the both of them. Because in his eyes, they're one. That's a very good line of thinking, and I think a lot of modern people could understand it in that
Yeah,
manner.
yes, that's. I think that's true, and I think that's why the current Western progressive monarchies in Europe have so much support. If people didn't see that, I don't think they would have as much support as they do.
Hmm. All right, all right. But question though, what would you say is good for the people? Because there's another thing. You're a progressive monarchist. What would you say? I'm sorry if I'm profiling you, but you seem to be a bit on the left. What would you say to a person who isn't a progressive monarchist and to whom you say a monarchist doing the opposite of what you want is what's best for the people? How do you train this monarch?
Well, training a monarch is something I think a lot of people have struggled with. I mean, in history, we see parenting and ruling is not exactly the same thing, and it's often hard for a ruling monarch to be a good parent. But I think that exposure and learning from experience and being involved from an early age is very important. A lot of people have said that King Charles and his sister, the Princess Royal, and his two brothers, his two younger brothers, did not have a good childhood. And people have accused Elizabeth II of being a bad mother because she did not pay as much attention to her children as someone else might. And I would say that that is why her children are, aside from Andrew, so successful and so poised and so elegant. And I would say that that is the a result of that training from an early age of being in that public facing role. And so, sure, did Charles not have as much time with a swing set as your average child? Of course. But does he have childhood trauma from growing up being raised by a ruling monarch? I don't think so. I think that training a monarch is definitely something that would be hard to write about or write like a manual about. You know, there's no guidebook for how to train a successful monarch. I think that having a successful monarch as a parent and being able to live in their shadow and under their supervision for as long as possible is very important. And I think that that is how you would sort of create the idealistic monarch is to teach them from an idealistic monarch. And to your point of you had asked how do we tell what is it what's in it for the people, I would say that the benefit of constitutional monarchy is that we would avoid the horrific political divide that is seen in the United States right now. I admit that I fully practice division and political divide in my everyday life. I won't go to restaurants that donated to the other side. I won't, I don't speak to people that I find to be in disagreement with, and I see myself doing it, and I know that it's not good, but that is the state of how we are as a country right now. But the advantage of having a constitutional monarch is that no matter who wins the election, you can still be a patriot. You can still love this country. I remember a couple months ago, President Biden said, "You can't love your country only when you win." And I thought, that's exactly how Americans think. That for the next 4 years, you will see liberals like myself talking about how terrible the United States is and how awful this country is. And they might be right in many ways or in the materialistic things that they're talking about. And for the last 4 years, you've seen conservatives talk about, oh, how this country is going to hell and what happened to our country. And that is something that you can avoid in a constitutional monarchy because there's something higher than politics. There's an identity that goes beyond party politics, that stretches above, where even if your political party didn't win, even if there are policies being enacted that you don't agree with, you're still a subject of that monarch, you're still a citizen of the country, you're still a patriot, you're still willing to give up your life for your monarch and for your country, and that goes beyond the party politics that tear apart the United States every day.
Well said, well said.
Thank you.
Also, thank you for speaking with me. How you said you sometimes don't go to people who disagree with you.
I
I will say thank you
it's
for
not
that.
that I don't want to sit down and discuss things. It's just that I often find myself thrust into arguments that I didn't want to have, like at the grocery store or something. It's like I don't want to argue with the average Trump supporter in line while I'm trying to buy milk. So,
I
but
get it, I get it.
yeah,
I wouldn't want to argue with someone I dislike either. But anyway, I find what you said very insightful because it's almost in a, how do I say this? To me, the American democracy, even though I'm a Bahamian, I don't live in America. It's like it's like say there's two or more, there's a bunch of gangs, and you as a citizen are in allegiance to one of those gangs, and you want them to win. And when your gang is in power, and thus your gang is the country, you love your country. But when your gang isn't, and it's somebody else's party, well, now you don't love your country. You just love the parts of the country where your gang is
exactly,
still has sway, still has power. So by there being something over the squabbling, over the gangs, so to speak, if there's this figure, sure the gangs can direct the country for a while. Maybe your gang isn't good for this particular situation. Maybe the next person's gang is, maybe your gang is. But by having this figure above it all, there's still something you could all connect and still strive and fight under, where
that's
there's
exactly right.
squabbling.
That is the point. And like you said, that we might have a political party that doesn't do the best, that doesn't help the people, but they only have so long, and the country will keep going. Whereas here in the United States, there's a legitimate concern that President Trump will find a way to remain in power, and he has alluded to that a couple of times, and it is a terrifying prospect that the 22nd Amendment, I believe that's the correct one, apologize if I'm incorrect, but that we could see a president dismantle the system, once he's reached the top and he's, destroying the ladder beneath him. And whereas in a constitutional monarchy, that is never something that you would ever see. Like even the most divisive and ideological British prime ministers over the last 50 years have all eventually offered their resignation to the Queen. It's terribly, I mean, as an American, I don't really have a strong opinion about British politics, but I find it quite satisfying seeing politicians disagree and bicker and horribly have this terrible uh, rhetoric, and then in the end they all are subservient to the monarch, and it creates a sort of a safety net where one person cannot destroy the system, and so that the system will continue for a very long time, hopefully.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, I agree. They've all sworn allegiance to the nation by swearing it to the monarch. So they may bicker, they may not like each other, but same way I'll say in the Holy Roman Empire, Me, a man of this province, may not like the men of this other province, but both men would still gladly fight for the monarch, for the nation. It's
Yes,
that
that's very
same
true. That's a great connection.
it's the same theory and practice. And you say what's wrong with America today, at least in your eyes, is there is no such theory. If a if a
Well, the
republic
idea of America was supposed to be that, like, the overarching thing above party politics in this country was supposed to be the Constitution and the rule of law. That no one in this country was above the law. That was the idea, was that at the end of the day, no one in this country, even the president, can get out of being held responsible according to the laws of this nation. And our laws are created by the legislative process, by the people. And so the idea of popular sovereignty is that the people control the laws and everyone is held accountable. But now that we have the United States Supreme Court, giving the president essentially full immunity to do whatever they want in office, and we have a convicted felon being elected to the highest office in the land, it seems that the rule of law has crumbled and that safeguard is gone.
hmm, okay, okay. But I have a question though. This all begs the question.
Yes.
Wouldn't he then be your monarch? No, because in my
This
opinion,
is a debate that I've seen play out a couple of times online about whether or not dictators are monarchs.
yes.
And in some ways, sure, the Kim family could be described as a monarchy because it's hereditary. If you look at the definition of monarchy, it's simply the head of state being hereditary. Um,
Hmm.
so it meets that requirement. But monarchists would not legitimize that family. Monarchists are constantly debating about legitimacy, legitimacy, legitimacy. It's probably the most common debate you'll find in any monarchist forum. The favorite, of course, being the argument of French legitimacy. If you're a Bourbon, an Orleanist, or a Bonapartist. So I would not see King Trump as a legitimate monarch, um, even if he passes it down to Don Jr. We would not legitimize that because for a lot of monarchists, especially in the center and on the right, but even on the left too, faith is a big part of monarchy, and the connection between the monarch and God is very important. The idea being that the monarch is born for a certain purpose, and only God can choose who is born and for what. And so Donald Trump was not born to be a king. He was born to an incredibly racist landlord in New York City who taught him to be a scumbag just like he was, and he, you know, grew up being a racist landlord in New York City. There's no royal legitimacy there, to be frank.
All right, all right, all right. Would you say it has to be voluntary? Would you say a monarch is in large part a voluntary, somewhat dictatorial figure? Is that an apropos
Voluntary on the monarch's part or the people's part?
the people's part? If suppose tomorrow 75%, three-fourths of Americans say, "I want I want King Trump," would he then be legitimate?
That's a really tough question, and I'm glad you've asked that.
Hmm.
I would go back to the precedent set by the Norwegians. If you're not familiar, the Norwegian monarchy is quite new, despite Norway historically being a monarchy since the days of the Vikings. The current king of Norway, Harald V, his grandfather was the first modern king of Norway, King Haakon VII, and he became king through a very interesting process. And I'll tie this back to the question you asked. After the Norwegians got their independence from Sweden, they realized that they had a throne and no one to put on it because for, I believe, a couple of hundred years, the king of Sweden had ruled both Sweden and Norway, And instead of simply annexing the kingdom of Norway, the Swedish king sat on both thrones. So he claimed the title of King of Sweden, but he also claimed the title of King of Norway. So when
Hmm.
Norway got their independence, there still existed a position of King of Norway. There was still a Norwegian throne, but now that the Swedish king no longer claimed that title, there was no one to put on it. And of course, the original Norwegian dynasty from hundreds of years ago had long since died out. So the Norwegians put out a call to any European nobility that wasn't doing anything and asked them to be the king. And back then in the early 1900s, there were many, many, many royals just sort of swimming about Europe looking for something to do with. We don't have that problem today, well, to an extent. But a young man who was a prince of Denmark and a prince of England came forward and he said that he would take the position, but only if there was a referendum from the people of Norway. And the Congress of Norway, the parliament, said they weren't really a fan of it, but he said that if you don't like it, find someone else. So they did a national referendum, and they had the entire country vote on whether to appoint this young man as the king or to be a republic. And the country overwhelmingly voted to become a monarchy. And so Haakon the Seventh, he took that name as a regal name. It's I'm forgetting his original name, but he took that regal name as Haakon the Seventh. It's a traditional Norwegian name, and his grandson is currently the king. So there is a precedent for monarchs to be elected, to be chosen, and in that case, the Norwegian people knew what they were voting for. They knew that they were voting to appoint this prince as their king, and that his descendants would be their monarch de facto. There are other elected monarchies, like I believe Malaysia has an elected monarchy where
Hmm.
um, the king is elected every 4 years, which I don't know very much about, so I won't try to speak on it. But there is a precedent to elect monarchs. Um, I would just say that electing King Trump would just be the personally a disaster for this country and very against the ideas of the founding of our nation. One thing I didn't mention yet is that progressive monarchists do not advocate for establishing new monarchies. If a country has overthrown their monarchy or has voted against it, then that is their prerogative as the people, and monarchy should not be forced upon them. I'm not gonna advocate for Estonia to become a monarchy. Like, that's they're one of the most functioning democratic nations in the world. They have no need. So that was a very long-winded answer, but that's what I would say about the United States electing Trump to a monarch position.
That is very interesting. But when you said it's almost contradictory to this entire conversation, you said that you are a progressive monarchist and you live in the United States, correct?
Yes,
Okay. You said all these values of monarchy, now you believe it could fix America's problems, correct?
that is true. I do think that a monarchy would be beneficial. Yes,
So how do you not promote a monarchy?
because the it goes back to the issue of legitimacy. You would cause a cataclysmic political disaster trying to figure out who would be the monarch. People have done it before. There have been. I feel like there's a post on r/monarchism about every week. It gets very old about who would be the king of the United States. I mean, there's different options. I mean, usually the number one theory is what if Washington had become the king, which some people advocated for. Some people wanted George Washington to become the king of the United States. It's a small minority, but people had said that at the time. So that's kind of what people go off of, and they, trace down George Washington's ancestry. And usually the thing that stops them in the tracks is when they realize that um, Lee, General Lee from the Confederacy, was Washington's male heir down the line, and they go, "Oh." um, so the reason I wouldn't advocate for established republics to adopt monarchy is because it's such a disaster to try to find a legitimate monarch. You find yourself going all the way back in history to find who was the monarch of that country originally, and that might be hundreds of years ago. And then you trace all the way down family trees and you find some guy living in that country and you go, hey, you're the king now. And it's like, hold on, who is this person? You know, like it's jarring and it's not an effective way to establish a monarchy. You're not gonna go through and pick some random guy and be like, hey, you're the king now. Like, that would be almost it would go against the whole idea of the monarchy. That it would negate the benefits of this apolitical head of state because you would the people would see them as unelected, obviously, because that's the whole concept of monarchy. But they would it wouldn't work. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, but to play devil's advocate, why not go back to England? Why not have one of Queen Elizabeth or King Charles' children become the new United States monarch? You could say the United States was ruled by them. They had a rebellion. Now they want to be more like them and go back into the monarchist
Now we want to go back. I
rule.
mean, it's a, sort of a pipe dream that I have every once in a while, but like, I are you proposing like we do a national referendum like the Norwegians did?
Why not? If a
If it
monarch must be for all
if it
intents,
passes, then by all means try. Like I Americans are conditioned from the earliest education to consider monarchy on the list of like no ideologies. They're like, oh, fascism and communism and monarchy. It's like, one of these things does not belong. Um, of course, you can have communist monarchies and fascist monarchies, but that's because you're comparing government systems to ideology. That's not the point. Americans are just so conditioned to hate monarchy. I mean, the average American would probably put King George III on the same list as the Hitler and Mussolini. So I don't see it being possible.
okay, that is funny. They'd actually put him on the same list as them.
Oh, it's terrible. Like, people openly hate on King George III. I saw a political ad. I'm going to college in Maine, and I saw a political ad from Senator King for his reelection, and he like, what was it? He put like an apple in like a apple chopper machine, and he said, "This is King George III. This is what we did to him." And I'm going, I, I don't know about that one. Like, um, yeah, like Americans openly hate on King George III, despite the fact that it was an elected body of individuals, the British Parliament, that implemented the taxes that everyone hated. Of course, the argument was that we didn't have representation in that parliament, but it still stands that King George III was not sitting around going, oh, let's tax the colonies. Like, no, it was the elected government of the United Kingdom that made that decision.
Okay, okay.
And many people would say that by that point, King George III was already starting to slip into mental illness, and it's not really clear how in control he was.
But how much power should a monarchy have? Like an example of King George, you could say, if he is the flesh and blood of the nation, should he have absolute power? The people are to look to him. As for the form and the spirit of the nation, then should he have absolute control of the nation? And if he does not have absolute control, then how representative of the nation is he?
Well, I would present to you the idea that most constitutional monarchs do have absolute power in the same way that an absolute monarch has, that they don't use it in that way. The United Kingdom, their political system is the most familiar to me, so I'll use that. But you see systems that are similar in other Western constitutional monarchies. But using the United Kingdom, for example, you have three branches of government, the same that we have here. You have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. They don't function the same way that ours does in the United States, but there are those three branches of government. And at the top of each is the crown. So obviously, executive, you have the prime minister who is the head of government, but the prime minister is appointed by the monarch. The monarch decides to appoint them, and obviously, by tradition, the monarch is going to appoint whoever was voted on. But it is the monarch's duty to appoint the prime minister, and so in the end, they have that control over who rules the government. On the legislative side, in the United Kingdom, if you ever see a picture of the British Parliament, you'll notice you have the green benches and you have the Speaker's chair, and in front of the Speaker's chair on the table is what's called the King's Mace. It's a very long golden stick. It's very ornate, and that represents the King's power to legislate, which is given to the House of Commons to make laws. And they are not allowed to debate laws unless the King's Mace is in the chamber. So, despite the fact that it's the Parliament making laws, they're making laws with the King's authority that has been given to them by the King. Obviously, if the King ever tried to change the system, it would cause untold chaos. But in the end, the monarch does have the authority to legislate in the United Kingdom. And when you look at the judicial system, like in the United States, our court cases are named the people versus, the defendant. Donald Trump was convicted in the case of the people of the state of New York versus Donald Trump. But in the United Kingdom, their court cases are named the defendant versus the monarch. That they are being tried against the monarch, which is it's abbreviated, so you don't really see it, but it's the defendant versus R, which stands for either Rex or Regina. And of course, all of the judges in the United Kingdom are appointed by the monarch. So I would say that yes, the monarch, even in a constitutional monarchy, has ultimate control. A lot of people would, in the monarchist community, would call that a ceremonial monarchy because they feel that the monarch would never be able to use that power. But the power exists, they have it, it is constitutional, and that's the way the government runs. So, yes, I think that they should have. Are you asking if I think they should have ultimate authority, or are you asking if they do?
I'm asking how much power should they have?
I think the system works the way it does now, where the monarch has absolute authority over the inner workings of the government, but they hand it over to the elected government because that allows the monarch to, I mean, not take it back. You're not going to have a monarch like holding it as sort of this bargaining chip to be like, oh, if you don't do what I want, we'll take away all your power. No, not like that. But in a sense that in a crisis, in a catastrophe, those powers of the government still exist. You saw on January 6th in the United States, um, we came very close to having a constitutional crisis, and it was averted because some very quick thinking congressional staffers brought with them the physical electoral ballots that had been cast by the states, and they brought those with them when they were evacuated from the House and the Senate floor. And if those had been left behind, and the insurrectionists had been able to take those and destroy them, it's unclear if Joe Biden would have been able to be inaugurated. Like, those physical ballots were the presidency. And, like, it's just such a fragile system where if one part of it's not there, it doesn't work. And so to have those powers invested in something that's more secure just makes me feel better about the future of the government. Where if something were to happen, if Parliament were to explode, like those powers still exist and they can still be exercised, even if one piece is missing here or one piece is missing there.
Okay, okay. Two questions though.
Yeah, of course.
Number one, you say that, but how is a human life any less delicate? What's to stop me or some insurrections, some conspirators for just killing the royal family? And secondly, could what's to stop America in their constitution just having a re-election if the ballots were tampered with? Could they not just have the election again?
I don't know what the United States would government would have done in that case because a lot of people when they talk about this is kind of off topic, but a lot of people when they talk about the insurrection, they talk about the physical violence on January 6th, which was horrific. I don't know how much of it you watched. I watched it live. It was one of the worst things I've ever seen. It was terrible. But that wasn't the biggest threat. The biggest threat was an effort that Donald Trump launched to subvert the election by using the sort of inner workings of the election system to coincide with the physical insurrection. So in the United States, we have the electoral college system. I'm sure you're familiar with that, right?
Mm, somewhat.
So each state votes, and whoever wins the popular vote in the state gets the state's vote. And each state gets a different number of votes depending on their population. So, in order to win the presidency, you need 270 electoral votes from the states. It doesn't necessarily matter how the population votes overall. So,
Mhm.
in the sort of logistical workings of that, you have each state casts physical ballots to Congress, and on January 6th, after each election, before the inauguration, Congress has to approve those ballots as being the real ballots. Or it's for many years, for hundreds of years, it was purely a ceremonial thing where, they voted to certify the ballots as being the real ones. So Donald Trump, who will not be convicted of this, unfortunately, made an effort to select a core of electors who carried the ballots to Washington who were not real to submit false ballots to Congress that would show that he won. And the idea was that if the physical insurrection could drive the Senate and the House of Representatives away from the chambers, and they could destroy the real ballots, and then they could submit the false ones, Donald Trump would legitimately be the president without any sort of forceful, taking over power, but by submitting these false ballots. And so we've seen convictions related to the people, the fake electors, the people that submitted false ballots. We've seen conviction of them, but the special counsel of the district attorney, Jack Smith, has ended the effort to convict Donald Trump of this effort to overturn the election, essentially. So the physical violence that we saw on Capitol Hill on January 6th was horrific, but that wasn't the extent of it. There was this huge plot beneath it to make him the president. And circling back to this entire discussion, that would not be possible in a constitutional monarchy because it is the monarch's role to appoint the prime minister, or in this case, the president. You would have an authority higher than that.
All right. All right.
Oh, and you had asked something else. Remind me what you had said.
You said how the current system is delicate, but I said, what's to stop me and some insurrectionists or some anti-monarchists from just shooting the royal family, from killing the royal family?
A lot of big, burly men with guns is the answer, really. Like, I mean, the royal family is heavily protected. It would appear that they are one of the least protected heads of state, but in the United Kingdom, in Norway, in Spain, I mean, they are heavily protected people. If you're talking about, like, ideologically, what would happen if we killed the royal family, it would be passed on. It would go down. And so even if you kill the nuclear family, the family would still continue through some other branch. I mean, the Spanish would have a very difficult time with that because right now there are no other branches. If you're familiar with the history of the Spanish monarchy, it's a mess. I mean, with the Civil War and the fascists, and so right now the current Spanish royal family is sort of all they have. So you're right, that is a fragile system. Um, but for other countries like the United Kingdom, there are plenty of people there. Their immediate line of succession goes down to I think 20 something people, and then the parliament is required by law by the Succession Act of 1701 to maintain a list of the next 5,000 people in line. So it's not really an issue for them.
Hmm. All right. All right. That seems like a smart way to do things now. As well as let's move on to progressive monarchism in general.
Yes.
How is that different from just, you say, just regular monarchism? What does progressive thinking or philosophy have to do with monarchism?
So progressive monarchism is the sort of the liberal version of monarchism. A lot of monarchists are deeply connected to their faith, and so they lean more conservative. Whereas progressive monarchists are not necessarily a secular ideology. Actually, I did a poll on the subreddit, and it's about half and half between people that believe in God and people that don't. So it's not necessarily defined as a secular movement, but there's definitely secular aspects to it. The main progressive idea behind the progressive monarchist concept is that if we're striving for equality, that the monarch is an apolitical person whose, you know, born duty is to serve all of their subjects equally. And so, if you are not bound by politics, the idea is that the monarch is going to be the monarch of everyone, no matter race or gender or sexuality or gender identity. That's the idea behind progressive monarchism, is that the monarch, as an apolitical person above party politics, can act as a vanguard for civil rights and can protect people from an otherwise potentially tyrannical government that might impose restrictions or oppression upon minority groups. Because even if they're the minority and the majority of the country dislikes them, they are still the king's subjects and they are still eligible and they're still eligible to the same rights as any other subject.
All right, all right. So that's the intersection there. Hmm. But I have a question though. We've seen throughout history kings go to war or want to go to war and do various many things. How could you have an apolitical person? That's the question. As you said with civil rights, I know some libertarians would say we should abolish civil rights because you're essentially doing the reverse of Jim Crow in their eyes. You're forcing people to get along.
Yeah, and that's why I think that libertarians are. I should use nice words. I find the libertarian ideology to be confusing and misguided. But in terms of is war politics, I would say that war is so intrinsically linked with the well being of the nation that the king making a decision about war is making a decision about the well being of the nation. And while they are above politics, they are thoroughly intertwined with politics. They know what's going on, they know who's who. It's not like they're going to walk into a cabinet meeting and need an introduction. Like, um, in a fully functioning constitutional monarchy, the monarch should be well informed, should be well educated on the workings of the political system, and should be able to make decisions for the country and should be able to levy their soft power behind closed doors to make political things happen. So in terms of, is war politics and should the king have the power to go to war, I would completely say yes. And we've seen that before. I was just researching recently because the British monarchy, of course, one of their powers is to declare war and peace, and there there are different laws in the UK. I can get into it later, but yeah, I think that war, while it is politics, it is the monarch's duty to be well informed and to be able to make that decision about whether or not the country is going to war, because in the end, the military is under the command of the monarch. They are his troops, and so that decision to go to war is going to affect his troops, and so that is a decision that is to be made by the monarch.
Hmm. All right, all right, all right. Okay, but as you say, you're leftist. My big
Yes.
takeaway is this: what would you say to monarch who doesn't do what you want them to do? Just how Joe Biden says you can't be a patriot. You can't be a patriot if you only support the country, only patriotic when you win. Wouldn't you say you can't be a monarchist if you only support the king when he does what you want him to do?
In the idealistic world, in the sort of, you know, best possible picture, the monarch is going to be well informed, well educated, experienced, have a good upbringing, and have a good training period under their parent. And so I would say that the monarch's decision is the monarch's decision. And what they say is law. And if you don't like it, that's that. Like, I mean, if the monarch decides to make everyone wear apples on their heads, that's ridiculous. But the idea is that the monarch is not going to make ridiculous decisions. And if they make a ridiculous decision, it's most likely because they have been either misinformed or not carrying out their responsibilities to the utmost of being well informed.
All right, but I'm just saying, in a monarchy, there wouldn't be anything like a say like a rightist monarchy. There wouldn't be a leftist monarchy. There wouldn't be a progressive or regressive monarchy. You'd all just be monarchists because if there really was a monarchy, no one else would have the power to direct the say political leanings of the monarch.
The
And
monarch should not have political leanings.
yes, yes, and the monarch should be apolitical in and of itself. But
Right. So you're saying that there's no way to disagree with the monarch, which, and I mean, I feel like people in the monarch's inner circle are going to disagree with them all the time. Like, they're going to have aides, they're going to have advisors who are going to tell them that if they're doing something they don't like, I don't think it is the prerogative of, the CBS host to say, oh, well, I don't like what this person's doing. I think they're an idiot. And it's like, well, go for it. Say that, freedom of speech. But the average person's opinion is not to be dismissive of the will of the people, but, you know, what's that famous? I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said, everyone loves democracy until they meet the average voter.
sadly true, yes.
So you are free to disagree with the monarch's decision all you want, but in a perfect world, the monarch's decision is better informed than yours is.
All right, all right. But what do you do if you don't live in a perfect world and the monarch is making bad decisions? Does the parliament then take over for a while or
If the
overrule the
monarch is
monarch's
making bad
decision?
decisions, that means that someone's not doing their job. And that's either the monarch themselves is, you know, deciding to sit on their state provided wealth and do nothing and not be well informed and not be well educated, or it's a failure on the part of the people around the monarch who are not either intentionally misguiding the monarch, as you saw sometimes during the reign of Queen Victoria, or are purposefully being hiding things from the monarch. Again, Queen Victoria suffered from a lot of that. People accuse her of being uncaring when really nobody told her anything. Um, so I would say that there's a fault in the system somewhere, and if it is the monarch that is the fault in the system, then it has to be someone's job to go and tell them to figure it out. And maybe that's their heir, maybe that's the rest of the royal family, but the parliament is well within. In that situation, the parliament is within their right to tell them to figure it the f out. And in the case where the monarch is acting maliciously, like the monarch we've talked about in sort of the spiritual senses of the nation. And so if they are acting against the nation's best interest, then they are no longer, they are no longer, they are abusing their God given power and they are no longer eligible for the rights and privileges of their role.
Hmm. All right, all right. That's
But we
good.
have to make sure that, it's not, because in the United States, people would say, well, oh, Joe Biden's policy is hurting the country. And it's like, well, you have to be clear that something that people are saying is not simply party politics, but is truly detrimental to the nation. For example, I would say that the King of Italy giving power to Mussolini was detrimental to the nation, and he, no pun intended, royally screwed up.
Okay, okay. I'll allow you that pun, though you
Thank
deny it.
you.
All right, all right, all right. The system seems good, I will admit. What would you say if someone say wants to succeed from the monarchy? What then? Would it be in the monarch's power to say no? Must the monarch
Like a
always be
person or a
voluntary?
territory?
Let's go both. First a
If a
person, then a
person wants to
territory.
denounce their citizenship, by all means. I mean, it's the benefits and the drawbacks of monarchy are clear, and it's a social contract where you are agreeing to be a subject of the king, and in turn, you give the king your loyalty, and the king protects you. And if you don't like that, you're free to denounce the king and leave. Of course, that's a very privileged way to put it because not everyone has the financial means to leave the country and to go start up their life somewhere else. But that's what I would say is that if you're not comfortable and you're not happy and you don't agree, there's no one telling you that you have to stay. And so I do see, the hypocrisy that not everyone has the means to leave the country, but that's the answer to someone doesn't like it. They're free to go. Um, in terms of a territory. Are you talking about like the king's homeland or an overseas territory?
Okay, suppose you're an American.
Yeah,
Well, you are an American.
I am.
Okay, suppose magically America became a monarchy and Texas decided to leave because they don't want no monarchy in their God-given American land.
Oh yeah, of course.
Would Texas then be free to leave? Or is the monarch justified in saying no you cannot? Is the monarch justified in
Well, I mean, under U.S. law, secession is illegal, but in terms of
it
this
is?
conversation, I would say it's complicated because on one hand, there's a precedent, right? You have territories of, like, for example, Scotland voted to leave the United Kingdom. And Queen Elizabeth, her public statement was she advised Scots to think very carefully about how they voted. And of course, people can perceive that message however they want. Um, but, she didn't say one way or the other, There was no, she didn't, and presumably, if Scotland voted to leave the United Kingdom, then they would go amicably. So, but in that example, there is a history of Scotland being independent. So I would say that if a core territory wanted to leave the country, my
Hmm.
first instinct is that something's wrong. Is that something is wrong in the government. Something is wrong with your monarchy. Something might be wrong with your monarch if people want to leave. Um, but if it's just an ideological difference that someone doesn't want to live under a monarchy, I feel like it is. I I guess I will say to let them go because if the monarch is, I mean, it's hard, right? Because in the ideal sense, they are getting something out of the monarchy that they're getting. There's a gain, there's a benefit to the monarchy, and so if they're not getting that, then something's wrong.
All right, all right.
Like I'll, for example, for example, China right now with their one
Mhm.
China policy, and they have all these territories that want to leave, and they're saying no, you're part of China, and we're going to be one China, and I just you know, there's a reason they don't want to be part of China, and it's not because they don't like the food. Like,
Hmm. All right, all right. So you say on the grounds of you simply don't want to be a monarch. You simply don't want to have a monarchy in power in your lands. You say that's an iffy reason for not wanting to join or for wanting to leave. But if there's an actual policy decision, like say you may only have one child, then that is an adequate reason to leave, and by all means, you should be able to leave
the territory or the people?
for the territory.
The territory. If the monarch makes a decision that goes against the local culture, then the monarch's made a mistake, first of all. Um, then I feel like forcing people to live under a political system is not helpful. And it has never worked, right? Like, there's no example of people being forced to live under a system they don't like and suddenly liking it, or over time starting to like it. Like, that's not something that happens. Um, don't tell the communists that. But like, if people don't like the system, they don't like the system, and so changing the system is an option. If the system's broken, of course they're not going to like it. So maybe fixing the system. But if they just don't like the system, they don't like the system, and you're not going to be able to convince them one way or another. So, and I don't think it's right to keep people under a system that they don't agree with or that hurts them in some way.
All right, all right. But then, just to just to bring this around to libertarianism for a moment,
Yes,
when you
I know.
say
I made a comment before that was perhaps too harsh.
no, 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 you're entitled to it. I won't judge you. But when you say that's a sort of a way libertarianism and monarchy could intermingle, you could say yes, in the kingdom of China, there's one emperor who's the emperor of China, but for each province, for each territory, there is another emperor or king who rules over that and who embodies that territory or province, who then pays homage to the one king of China. Wouldn't you then say it would be best, a monarchy system would be best, well, every territory is then has their own king who then pays homage to one single king, or is there simply one single king who rules over everything?
Most progressive monarchists would say that the the monarchy works best as the overarching central system, and that those local rulers should be elected. That popular sovereignty is effective at a local level, and I would tend to agree. I think that is. I don't think that having local unelected officials is a very effective way to run the government, because the monarch making overarching broad decisions about whether or not to go to war is vastly different from a local leader deciding which bridge to build. Like, I, yeah, I, I don't think that having local monarchs or having monarchs of certain localities is a good idea. And if you do end up interviewing someone from neo feudalism, and if you do, God help you, end up talking to dirt balls, um,
Dirt, dirt balls?
Derp Balls is the he founded the neo feudalism site. Many
Okay.
people in the monarchist community can't stand him. I'm not a fan of his ideas, but I'll let him post. Um, he's been banned from r/monarchism. He believes that every country should be a Liechtenstein, that we shouldn't have big countries, that rulers shouldn't can rule land that they don't live in, and that everywhere should be a tiny monarchy, which just I just don't agree with. Like, I don't think that monarchy works on a local level,
Why not?
because the decisions that impact the locality are need like the issues that are important to the locality need to be handled by someone from the locality.
Is not the monarch then part of the locality? No, if every country's like
Yeah, you're
Liechtenstein.
right. Like if the monarch is from the locality, I bet in this modern world where like people, I, the idea of like being born and is sort of very 50 years ago. Um, I'm just not sure it would work. Like having, I come from a very affluent 95% white town, and there are certainly families that have been in Barrington. Sorry, I just doxed myself, but that's fine. There's a couple of them in the U.S. It's fine.
Uh,
There are families that have been in this town for a very long time
yeah,
that like have generational control and generational wealth, and we all hate them. Like I just I feel like it just does not blend with the idea of a local community. Even less so in like an urban area, like in New York City. Like you saw like the two governors who were father and son, and people didn't like that. Like um, so I'm not sure I can provide a good enough reason for why I don't like it. I just don't.
mm, understandable, understandable. Well, we've reached the hour mark.
Yes,
Now it's time for free discussion. Now, I've said my piece. Now, is there anything you want to say? Anything you want to teach me or tell the view about monarchism in general? It's your time now. Anything you want to say?
I'm thinking. I will say one thing I wasn't able to tie into our discussion was the importance of connecting the monarchy to the civil services.
Mm-hmm.
We see in the United Kingdom that the police and the ambulance service and different civil services like the post, the mail, and different public works are connected to the monarchy. And I think that it is critically important to keep those systems out of party politics. And it doesn't really work in the United Kingdom. Like you don't see the monarch like doing anything with the London ambulance service. And you rarely see them interacting or having any connection with the police. But I think that it's important, at least in my belief system, and I think many monarchists would agree, that keeping critical government functions out of the hands of grubby politicians is super important for the people. That when you have the police and the fire and the ambulance, when you have these critical services that people depend on in the hands of politicians that have something to gain, it doesn't end well. And we see it in the United States where we have a crisis of rural medical care, where there's parts of the United States out in the Midwest where you might be hours away from an ambulance. And if you have a farming accident in your field, bye. Like, no one's coming to help you. And the person that's an hour away is a volunteer who is working with equipment that they bought with donations from GoFundMe, who is getting measly government subsidies because in the United States, only 7 states consider emergency medical care as an essential service. And that needs to not be a thing. Like, people die because of it. So I think that the connection between the monarchy and the armed forces is very strong in a lot of countries. And that's important too for different reasons. But I think that the connection between the monarchy and the civil services is so important to maintaining a democracy so that politicians can't slash critical budgets and then celebrate about how good the economy is. Because people will die. And the first that will die will be the most marginalized communities. They won't be the average, middle class person. It's going to be the person living under the underpass who has an overdose and there's no one there to save them. So that's one thing I wasn't able to bring up in our discussion.
All right. It seems good, instead of a squabbling gangs who I said before fight against each other, controlling these things, you have just one overarching figurehead who has control over all these things to ensure that everyone gets, say, an equal chance to
Yeah,
survive.
and it's not that the monarch is going to be, involved in everyday running of these services, but when the government says, "Hey, we're slashing the budget of XYZ," the monarch can say, "Hold on a second, you know, that's not acceptable." Right? That's the goal, is that the monarch acts as a last line of defense against a government fucking everything up.
All right, good point, good point. Anything else?
Do you want to talk about the British Commonwealth, seeing as you are a subject of King Charles III and a
Yes, I
citizen of a
am.
Commonwealth nation?
Yes, I am, of course. Uh, he's still technically my king, I suppose.
Yes. I feel like it's an interesting discussion these days. I'm with, the changes of monarch, and there's such deep connection between Elizabeth II and the Commonwealth that is not shared, but with, the current king, just because he's a new person. How do you personally feel about the Commonwealth?
Hmm. In truth, I never really thought of it much, but I will say I quite like it, and I'd like it more if Britain or if the English actually gave us something or did something.
You
What do
cut
I
out
get
there
for
for a
being
second.
part of?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
I'd say I suppose I like it. I like the brotherhood with other countries, other communities across the world, and I'd like it even more if the English did a little more, if they did something.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that the Commonwealth needs to be more functional. Like the cultural connection between these countries around the world is super important. And we see that with the Commonwealth Games and these connections between Nigerians and people from Jamaica. Like it's great, but I agree that the Commonwealth does not do enough. Some people would argue that if the Commonwealth did more functional things, it would be neo-colonial, and it would be an overreach of British rule.
I'd argue then what's the point? You're having an organization that doesn't do anything intentionally. At that point, why not disband it?
Yeah, I think you're right. People say that, and the danger people argue is that you get a system like the francophone, where you have the French government economically strangling former French colonies by forcing them to keep the same currency and imposing. Obviously, if they use the French currency, then the French have that economic control over them. Do you think that is a form of neocolonialism?
Hmm. Yes, a nation must have its own currency.
I agree. Yeah, I don't like what the French do, and I feel like nobody talks about it enough because there is sort of this cultural connection between monarchism and uh, imperialism that really needs to die. Like France had a colonial empire. It still has a colonial empire, and it continues to strangle their colonies. And France is just about as anti-monarchist as it gets.
Hmm.
Just my little rant there. Trying to think if I have any other questions for you. Being,
I will say in truth, I quite like the British monarchy. I think they're quite neat.
yeah, they it's definitely fascinating to see how the system works. And even if I don't agree with everything they do, I mean, do you think at heart King Charles is a good man?
I don't know him at all.
That's a good answer.
Hmm. He survived to an old age, so he can't be that bad.
Uh, Donald Trump is 78. Um, yeah, I like the king, but he definitely has luggage that he brings with him to the crown, with all the controversy about his relationship, and the death of Diana didn't help. All right, I don't think I have anything else for you.
All right. Well, do you want to end the interview?
Unless you have anything else to ask me, I think I'm all set.
You know what? I'll go for the right one. If you could decide who's going to be the next monarch of the United States government, who would you choose right now? This power is all in your hands. Who would you pick?
Barack Obama.
Barack Obama.
I think he's a well educated man. He's considered the greatest orator of our time politically. He was able to build a coalition of liberals and conservatives to get elected by a landslide. Um, he is relatable to a lot of people. He bridges a critical racial gap in this country that I feel like we definitely miss being post Obama. Um, he has a perspective of um, being from Hawaii, which we don't often see in presidents. I mean, um, and his daughters would make excellent heirs. They are well educated. They make an effort to be educated. Um, Michelle Obama is a wonderful woman, despite what she did to our school lunches. I guess that's my answer.
All right. All right. All right. My second question is,
Okay.
what would you say about someone who says monarchy is straight privilege? Well, if you're a monarch, you almost have to be straight, because how else are you going to have an heir?
That's an interesting question, and I'll tell you now that I'm openly gay, so this is something that comes up a lot. Um, I realize that monarchy has to be passed down hereditarily. There's no there's no way around that, right? Like there's no right now at least we don't really have the technology for that to happen. If a gay monarch attempted to do a surrogacy, the questions of legitimacy would never end. It would be like I many people would not see that as legitimate, and honestly, I might not either. Um, so I would say that the monarch is free to be gay. I mean, everyone's free to be gay. I'm free to be gay, but the monarch, one of the monarch's roles, one of their most important duties, is to continue the monarchy. And so, if there is another branch, if they have a sibling who has children, then by all means, marry whoever you want. Like, if it turns out that Prince George, the second in line to the British throne, William's eldest, if it turns out that he's gay and he marries a man, it's not a problem because presumably Princess Charlotte will have children and her child will be the heir to the throne. And so I would say, as long as there's an heir, it's not a problem. The issue is, if there's no heir, I would have an issue with them ending the bloodline just because. Like it just the struggle of finding the next legitimate monarch could be impossible if they're Spanish. If they're the Spanish monarchy really has no other options right now. Like Princess, uh, what is her name, Leonora. she has to have children, or else it's gonna like her sister could have children. That child could be the heir, but you're gonna end up in a situation like Japan where you're gonna have a succession crisis, and there's nothing more ugly than a succession crisis. Wars are fought over succession crises, so obviously I don't think that would happen today. The royal family would just end, but it's terrible. But if that is how you were born, if you're born the monarch, you need to have an heir.
Mm.
And I'll say personally, if that was my responsibility, that's what I would do.
All right, all right, understand.
It is a contentious discussion that I don't pretend to speak for all monarchists or even all progressive monarchists. I'm sure everyone has different ideas about what to do if the reigning monarch is gay or lesbian. I mean, there's no precedent, right? There's no one to look back at and say, how do we do this?
All right. I suppose my last question is: wouldn't there have to be a preferential treatment for men to be the monarch other than women?
Absolutely not.
Because my question is this: if you have a queen or a child, she marries a man, wouldn't then the entire bloodline be sort of muddled?
No,
Why?
I reject that notion. Um, no offense, but that is something that comes up a lot. Um, are you familiar with the Jacobite movement?
No.
They are a group of British monarchists who believe, or Jacobite, I believe, who believe that the current monarch is not legitimate because his bloodline goes through a female. And they are loud and annoying, and I don't like them, with all sincerity. I think that the idea that a woman's blood is not capable of, um, you know, connecting a monarch to their ancestors is just wrong and disgusting. Like, it's if we're going to talk about why monarchy is hereditary, it's many people would say that it's faith, that it's the spirit of God that has been given to one person that is passed down. And there's no reason why a woman cannot pass down the spirit of God to her child. I In this modern era, there's absolutely no reason why a woman cannot be the reigning monarch or cannot pass down the titles. It's just it doesn't make sense. It might have made sense at one point, um, to prefer a man to be the monarch for political or social or even physical reasons. But today, there's no excuse for what is called male preference primogeniture, where the male takes precedent. Like, for example, right now, the King of Spain has two daughters, and if he were to have a son, his son would take precedent over the Princess Royal, which I just think is goes against the whole spirit of monarchy because Princess Leonora has been training her whole life. She's finished her time at the Army Academy. She's currently studying at the Naval Academy, and then she'll go to the Air Force Academy. She's doing everything she needs to be the monarch, and she'll be a wonderful Queen of Spain one day. And I hate thinking that like they could have a son and then he would take precedent over her. Like it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't see. I mean, if we truly believe that we are all God's children, we're all God's children. We're not all God's sons. We're all God's children. So yeah, that's what I believe. I think most progressive monarchists would believe that too. Is that absolute primogeniture is the only acceptable succession ideology.
Hmm. Understandable, understandable. Well, I suppose my final question to you would be:
Okay.
what would you say is something you wouldn't want in a monarchical system where other monarchists would? What's something you just
Oh,
don't want?
that I don't agree with.
Yeah. Besides male primogeniture. primogeniture.
Right. Um, Trying to think here.
Think away.
There was recently a post on r/monarchism where someone said, "I wish royals would stop marrying non-royals." And it went about as well as you can imagine. I mean, some people were like, "Yay," and some people, including myself, were like, "What?" Um, this person who posted said some pretty nasty things about a variety of people. He called um, the heirs to the British throne, George, Charlotte, and Louis, half bloods because their mother, Diana, was a commoner, which is actually incorrect because she descended from British nobility. So if we're gonna talk about like royal blood, blah blah blah, the whole eugenics part of monarchism, I don't like, and I don't agree with, and I think a lot of progressive monarchists would agree with me that this whole idea of pure royal blood is how we got disfigured jerks like Charles II of Spain, where like the inbreeding needs to stop. Like it makes a bad name for monarchists, and it creates bad monarchs. You know, there's serious issues with inbreeding, and so when people get all on their high horse about, well, they're not legitimate because their parent wasn't a royal. It's like that's just such an archaic thing to say. Like, I mean, calling Prince George a half blood, are you like, you can have that opinion, but that is some strong language that is just like, I cannot imagine anyone who believes in monarchy to have such opinions about people who are legitimate heirs to a throne. So that gets really weird because there's a slippery slope down to like, and you saw the whole controversy with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry and all the issues about like racism in the British royal family. And, like we don't need to bring eugenics into monarchism. It doesn't belong. The titles and the role of monarch are passed down hereditarily, and you know that's that. Like it doesn't need to be more complicated than that.
Mm.
Like if the parent was the monarch, then you're the monarch. Congratulations. Like it really doesn't matter. And if people want to get all uppity about like, oh well, this person's not like it, like like look at any royal family. You will find issues where you know your perfect pure blood, fairy tale monarch wasn't so pure after all, and we'll still respect them and recognize their God given authority. And if you don't, then get the fuck out.
Mm.
That was a bit of a rant, but
No, 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 no. Rants are good. It was a good rant. But I suppose you're right. But I'd say this: if the monarchy is supposed to represent the people in the land, then wouldn't you say racism has a special place in monarchy? Like, how could you say you're the king of England and your children are the bloodline are the spiritual successors of England, yet they're half Chinese? Does that
but only
contradict?
half,
They're not
right?
full.
Like, are we gonna play with percentages here? Like, they are legitimate by law. Like their parent was the monarch, even if the other parent wasn't,
Okay,
and got like, if they don't look the same as their parent because of the other parent, people need to get over it. Like,
all
it's
right.
not unheard of to have monarchs that are not, don't look the same or don't like. For example, King George III was the first English like was in the dynasty at least. Like he was. Oh, what was it? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting this perfect information. But for example, you had monarchs like George II who did not speak English. He was the king of England, and he didn't speak English. So, like, if we're gonna count pennies, it's not helpful.
All
And,
right,
like, if they're half Chinese, they're only half. It doesn't matter what they look like.
all right. But then bouncing off that, could I adopt a child and make them the next monarch if I'm
There
king?
are royal families that have used adoption in the past. Like the Japanese, for example. They are the longest continuing royal family in the world. I think 1400 years it's been the same family since the mythical creation of Japan. And they did that through adoption, where, the bloodline would end and then they would adopt. But Japanese royal adoption wasn't exactly, they didn't just adopt random people. They would adopt cousins, essentially. The royal family was huge in the medieval Japanese period. So there were cousins that were quite far away that would be adopted to be the heir. Um, is adopting someone who's not a blood relative legitimate? I would say no. I mean, there needs to be some hereditary connection for them to be legitimate, unless the precedent set by the Norwegians is strong, but they set a precedent to select one man to be monarch, and his descendants will be the monarchs of Norway forever. So don't. I don't know. It's a very good question. The adoption question is one that plagues people because the simple answer is just flat out no. But
All right,
on the other hand, it's the monarch's decision because if they want to change the law, then they can change the law. So it's complicated.
all right. But the reason why I asked is because it's this. Now, suppose King Charles, in his old age, had
Yes.
sex with an English woman, and this new English, fully English heir became the heir. But before then, he had an older, say, half Chinese heir. Wouldn't most people say the full English heir should be the heir to the throne in most monarchies?
Almost every monarchy that I've heard of, if they're the same gender, then preference goes to the older one, no matter what. Like regardless of anything else. I've never heard of any monarchy, going by what percentage of blood they are. It's just going to be the older legitimate heir, no matter what, even if it's by minutes. Which princes' coups are the famous coup.
All right,
Yeah. I would always side on the with the oldest, and I think most people would as well. There's no precedent for it saying, well, they're more legitimate than legitimacy is a checkbox, not a percentage.
all right. Well, I suppose that wraps up the interview.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for talking to me. We probably went over an hour. Oh yeah.
No,
Um,
no, no, no. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure, man. I love
thank you.
talking to you.
Yeah, check out the subreddit. Take a look. We talk
Yeah,
about
yeah.
crazy stuff.
I'll definitely post this video to this subreddit and the neo feudalism one as well.
Oh God, yeah, go for it.
It was lovely talking to you, man.
Thank you
All
very
the
much.
best.
Have a good night.
You too, man. You too.